Welcome everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Have you heard the buzz? It's fly season. I am Morgan Green. I am Sprague's marketing specialist. During this presentation, if you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A function and we will get to them at the end. A recording of this webinar will be available, and be sure to follow Sprague on LinkedIn and Facebook to stay up to date on future events. Today, I am joined by Ashley Roden and Brandon Cole. Ashley is our technical manager here at Sprague. She holds an MS in entomology from the University of Georgia. She is also a board certified entomologist who has over 8 years of experience in the pest control industry. She is our technical manager and lead technical trainer here at Sprague. And she is also known for her guest speaking and presentations at many of the Pest Control Association industry trainings. Brandon is our Boise Branch Manager. He joined Sprague as a route manager in 2017 after a distinguished career in the United States Army. Brandon has worked with numerous food processing and seed storage clients to develop their pest control programs and food safety programs before being promoted to our Boise Branch Manager in 2019. Brandon earned a Bronze Star Medal with Valor and a Purple Heart during combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan as a member of the 101st Airborne Division. He retired in 2017 as a senior non-commissioned officer after a 14-year career in the Army. And in 2020, his Boise branch was named the Branch of the Year. Ashley, if you can go to the next slide. So a little bit about Sprague. In this year, we were ranked as the second largest commercial-only pest control provider in the PCT magazine's top 100 list. We are a family-owned and operated company since 1926. We operate 20 branches out of 10 states across the entire Western United States. We have a global vision with a local execution. And what that means is our field teams live and work in the communities that we serve. And we think that that practice is best in allowing our teams to truly provide the uncompromising service to our customers. Next slide, please. Across the 10 states that we operate in, we service customers, commercial customers across a multitude of different industries, whether it's agriculture, hospitality, education, commercial property, housing, and restaurants. Next slide, please. And next, I will hand it over to Ashley to talk about fly biology and behavior.
Thank you, Morgan. I'm Ashley Roden, and I'm going to be taking you through some information about flies. So first off, what makes a fly? So flies come in many different shapes and sizes, and we're going to talk about some characteristics of flies on the next slide. But all the creatures you see on this image right here, all of these things are flies. So some of them can look like moths, like this moth fly over here on the left-hand side. We have a syrphid fly or flower fly here in the middle. It's a bee mimic. People sometimes think they have bees and wasps when actually they have flies, because flies can often mimic stinging insects. And over here on the right, we have robber flies. So this is a really cool fly you might see around your property, and it goes around and grabs other insects and eats it. Looks very vicious. Obviously great at catching other insects, but it's a fly. Not all these flies are ones that we deal with in pest control, but it's really important to be able to identify a fly. We train our employees on how to identify a fly, also how to tell the most common species, because flies like to look like other insects, and they don't all look like the traditional housefly. So how can you tell if you actually have a fly? So the first thing is looking at the number of wings. So flies are one of the rare insects with only 2 wings total. So that means they only have 1 pair of wings. And then that second pair of wings that most insects have, but flies do not, are reduced to these little things called halteres, which you see in this image kind of highlighted in pink. So they might use these things for balance. but they are reduced. It's their second pair of wings, and they've been reduced to just these little knob things that you see on this picture. You can see them in crane flies really, really well. Some other flies, it might be a little bit hard to see, but most flies overall have only one pair of wings, so 2 wings total. And then that second pair of wings is reduced to halteres. Often, not always, but often flies also have really big eyes. So if we go back to this previous picture and you see the fly in the middle, has only one pair of wings. You can't see those halteres, but look how big those eyes are. Those are fly eyes. And that is a dead giveaway. It is probably a fly, not a stinging insect, and we don't have to be worried about it. So knowing these features, you can identify insects you've never thought of or seen before as a fly. So this critter right here, it is mimicking a wasp, but it's actually a fly because you can see those halteres very clearly, and then the single pair of wings. This is something you might see when you're out hiking, when you're in the mountains, but it is not something that would traditionally be a pest. But it's just, it's good to know what a fly is, because the first step of any program to take care of flies is to identify what you have. So let's talk about some fly behavior. So flies are very successful. Probably everybody has dealt with flies at their home or business before. So what makes them so successful? First off, they are highly mobile, especially those large flies. So if you have house flies or maybe even like horse flies, deer flies, those kind of flies are very strong flyers. They can come from miles away. So the source of the problem might be quite far away. It's also good to remember when it comes to flies, when you see adults flying around, that's not the area where they are laying their eggs. That's not where their larva is breeding. Those are just the adults. So to actually solve a fly issue and stop it, most of the time you have to do some investigating and figure out where they're actually spending their larval stage and where they're laying their eggs. They also have a large number of eggs. So most flies can lay hundreds of eggs, and they can lay them very quickly. We especially see this in warmer months. So when it's warm outside this time of year, flies are flying around more. They're looking for spots to lay their eggs, and they can lay hundreds of eggs. So in this image, all these things that look like grains of rice, these are actually eggs from blowflies. So blowflies like to find trash. They love dumpsters. They also like, if there's an area where pets are leaving behind feces or something, they love feces. They love dead animals. They love all that gross stuff. The adult females find that, and she lays her eggs right there in the disgusting stuff, which also can facilitate transmission of nasty pathogens because they're hanging out in some really nasty spots. So lots and lots of eggs. And they also go through their life cycle really quickly, especially when it's warm. So once it's warm, that can speed up the life cycle. They could go from egg to adult within a series of 1 to 2 weeks. So it's really, really fast. When it cools down, it'll slow down. This time of year, though, we see more flies because they are laying more eggs and they're going through that life cycle very quickly. Flies also don't need that much food. So especially when you're dealing with something like a small fly, maybe a fruit fly of some sort, they can find the smallest areas to feed in and lay their eggs in. So it's very important to have a good inspection done when you're having a fly issue, because we can have very, very tiny areas where moist, nasty debris is building up. And, the facility might smell great, might look great. Those flies can still find the smallest area, lay their eggs in there, and continue their life cycle. So it does not take much food in order for them to continue their life cycle. And this is what the fly life cycle typically looks like. So this is a fruit fly, and flies have a complete metamorphosis. So that means they have a larval stage, which is sometimes called a maggot. And that looks like a little worm thing. It usually doesn't have a very defined head. And typically the larva needs a very moist environment. So the female adult fly will lay her eggs in the food source for the larva. So that moist, nasty gunk, that's where she wants to lay those eggs. And then they hatch into the larva or maggots. They crawl around in there. They might mold a couple times and get bigger. Next up is the pupal stage. So typically with the pupal stage with flies, they crawl out of that gunk that they've been feeding in and they pupate nearby. So they make a cocoon and become a pupa. They'll do that nearby, but in like a drier surface than where they spent their larval time. So if you find a fly pupa, that means you're really close to the breeding area, but not exactly right in it in most cases. They'll spend a little time in that pupal case and then they'll pop out of it as an adult fly and they'll fly around, mate with each other, start the cycle all over again. This can happen very quickly. And if one female can lay hundreds of eggs, obviously a problem can get out of hand pretty quickly. So when it comes to pest management, typically what we're dealing with are two categories of flies. So we'll deal with large flies, and we'll look at that a little bit more later, and we'll deal with small flies. So you might hear those two terms when it comes to pest management. And then for both types of flies, we're trying to find the source of the problem, trying to find where they're laying their eggs, where their larva is feeding, and that's what we're trying to stop. So it's not always possible to do that. But in order to totally solve a fly problem, you need to find the source wherever they're laying those eggs. So let's start with small flies. So we'll see some examples on the next slide of species we consider small flies, typically like fruit flies. They may originate inside or outside of a facility. A lot of times in more milder climates, we'll see them just on the inside. But once you get into really warm areas, they might be breeding outside as well. They can complete their entire life cycle indoors. And usually they're not seasonal. So if you're a restaurant and you have fruit flies or some other facility with fruit flies, you'll see fruit flies year round. You might see more in the summer, less in the winter, but because they can complete that life cycle indoors, they're not seasonal. And sanitation is very, very important in order to reduce their population. So there's some other things we can do, and Brandon will be the one to talk about that in detail, but sanitation is very critical in getting rid of as many of these flies as possible. So here are a few species that we tend to see when it comes to small flies. First up on the top left is just your typical fruit fly. We actually deal with several species. This is the red-eyed fruit fly right here, but you might see dark-eyed fruit flies. Just to note, there is a agricultural pest I've been seeing more on the West Coast that is called the spotted wing Drosophila. So they're related to our fruit flies that show up in our kitchen, except you'll see a spot on the wings of the male ones. So fly identification is very important, because if you have that spotted wing Drosophila, that's an outdoor issue. They're probably eating like the fruit on your trees. But if you have typical red-eyed fruit flies, that's an indoor issue. I have spotted wing Drosophila in my yard. I've been seeing them around more and more. And it's because I have fruit trees. So it's not a problem with my sanitation, at least. Next up, we have the drain fly, which you see over here on the upper right-hand side. Sometimes it's called the moth fly as well. Kind of looks like a moth, very furry wings. There's many species we deal with. And typically we see these guys coming out of drains, sewer systems. They like to die in windows. They're not too attracted to light traps, so it can be kind of hard to figure out where they're coming from in some cases. So very common in bathrooms. Oftentimes, if a facility hasn't been in operation for a while, your drains will dry up and the P traps will dry up and you'll start seeing drain flies flying out. because they can get around that P-trap because there's no longer water in it. On the bottom left, we have phorid flies. You know, you could maybe not consider these small flies, but they're very small in size. And they're about the size of a fruit fly, look very similar. And it's important to be able to tell the difference between the two. Phorid flies have a hump back. They have their veins on the wings look a little different than other flies, and their legs look a little different. Phorid flies indicate that there is like a major nasty gunky problem, and it's typically associated with the pipes under a building, and it can be difficult to solve that issue. Okay, so let's talk about a case study. I thought that might be a good way to talk about some of these flies. So the first one is this restaurant, very nice restaurant. And we started seeing lots and lots of little flies with dark eyes flying around the restaurant, hung up a sticky fly trap, which you see over here on our right, and lots of little flies caught. Staff are very annoyed. They're afraid they'll start flying out in the dining area. Obviously, nobody wants to see that. So the first step, of course, is figuring out what kind of fly they are. So in this case, they were dark-eyed fruit flies. And what do we do next? So our job would be to go in and inspect with a flashlight and try to figure out where they're breeding. As I've mentioned before, you want to find the source, where they're putting their eggs, where their larvae are crawling around, and getting that removed is typically what's going to solve the problem. So we're going to look around with a flashlight. When it comes to small flies, using your nose can be really useful as well. So they like fermenting and also like dirty areas. So just walking around and like smelling, you might notice some areas that don't smell very well. And of course, going around monitoring where exactly are these flies coming from. There's hard to reach areas. So using something like glue traps or something over the drains, you can figure out exactly where they're coming from. And unfortunately, this is a restaurant, and a lot of restaurants are set up like this nowadays. Cabinets built right on top of drains. So this is very typical, makes it very hard for staff to clean, makes it hard for us to come in and inspect, makes it hard for us to clean if you need us to help you clean. So not ideal, but perfect for the dark-eyed fruit fly. So we see right here, blocked drain, and that is where the flies were coming out of. You might, we'll come in and actually look around a little bit more. In this case, I did take my camera on my phone and I couldn't see into the drains because they were blocked. So I just took a picture, and it turns out some of the drains actually had corroded and there was gunk going straight under the floor, which also contributed to the pest issue. And this is not something I could see just by looking up the drain because it was just completely blocked. But thankfully nowadays we have cameras and lots of fun stuff, so we can help figure out exactly what's going on. Looking around, more gunk in drains. Some pupa were found in a drier area. It means we are very close to the nesting sites. And then you realize there's some areas that are just currently impossible to clean. So this is under some cabinets. Again, stuff falls down there and it's just not set up for cleaning to be that easy. However, it's something that's necessary when it comes to this sort of fly, if we do want to eliminate this fly. Also, an important thing to look at are the soda lines. So as you can see in this picture, the lines tend to lay horizontal, and sugar and other stuff can build up when they're laying horizontal, and that gives a perfect breeding spot for flies. And also grout lines as well. So over time, especially if floors are being sprayed down with water, high pressure water, which is a typical way for a restaurant to clean their floor, grout lines can start disintegrating, and then food can build up in there. and that can contribute to a fly problem. So lots of dark-eyed fruit flies were found. So what can we do? There are lots of breeding sites. When you go through a place like this, you're going to find lots of little breeding sites. And the problem can be attacked in several ways. So Brandon will talk about this more. Sanitation is something we need to build on. So definitely sanitation. Is there a way to like move around equipment so there's not areas that are getting food stuck under it anymore? We can come in and do bioremediation. So those are products that come in and contain bacteria, and that bacteria eats away fats, oils, and greases and turns it into CO2 and water. That can really help, especially those low grout lines, some of those areas that aren't easy to reach. Doing a bioremediation treatment can really clean up those areas and reduce the flies. There's landing zone treatments, so perhaps you could put pesticide on areas where the flies are landing, and when they touch the pesticide, they end up dying. We have products like growth regulators. So insects have certain hormones in their bodies, and there are pesticide products that affect those hormones that are only in insect bodies and can make it so that they can't make it to adulthood correctly. And, you know, in this case, there were some issues that couldn't be fixed with these other things. So structural repairs were necessary just because food was building up in some areas so badly. So whenever we're trying to solve a fly issue like the one we just looked at, it's good to stack the effects. So we want to use multiple ways to target the flies, remove their breeding sites, stop them from reproducing. Okay, so let's look at another case study. So in this case, it is a retail store with flies. Pretty normal store, no food. Everything looks normal. And small flies are suddenly appearing. We have a light trap in the store and it's just filling with flies. Everything looks very, very clean. And this is the fly that we're having trouble with. So if you see it, if you start catching a whole bunch of flies when you didn't have a problem before, it's a very good sign you have forward flies. So this is a forward fly. It's also called like a scuttle fly. It has that humpback I talked about before. And they're also associated with mausoleums. They're often in hospitals. They're really like nasty gunk. So very good sign that you have forward flies are tons and tons and tons of captures and light traps. So light traps are great for flies. We'll talk about them for large flies in a second, but they are great for monitoring flies, and especially for large flies, they're great for you know, redirecting the fly from getting deeper into the facility. But in the case of forward flies, they're great for monitoring. So this is kind of what would happen inside a light trap if you had forward flies. You would just start catching hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tiny, tiny flies. So we have to take what we know about forward flies and figure out where the problem is. So forward flies, typically what we'll do is start with covering the drains with glue traps, kind of try to narrow down where they're coming out of. Typically it's an issue with the pipes under the building. So in this case, a plumber had to be called in and a camera had to be sent down the pipes, and there was a giant hole. So all the stuff that's going down the drains is actually ending up outside those pipes and going into the ground. So forward flies will not be stopped unless you dig that up. So identifying the fly was critical in this case. Light traps were great at monitoring for that fly, and they'll be great to monitor whether the problem is actually over, but the organic matter had to be removed. So in this case, which you don't always have to, this doesn't always end up being the case, the floor had to be opened, and then all that nasty gunk that had leaked out of the pipe had to be removed in order to get rid of these flies. Okay, so that's a little overview on the sorts of things we see with small flies. Let's go on to large flies. So large flies, we'll see some pictures in a second, are typically like our house flies or our blowflies. They typically originate outside the structure. So they could be breeding in the dumpster site. If you're in an agricultural area, they might be breeding on the farm nearby. They can also, some of them can complete their life cycle indoors. So if you start seeing something like a blowfly, and we'll see a picture in a second, they might be coming from outside, but there also might be an animal that's died in your building and the blowfly has found it. Blowflies can find dead bodies within minutes. So that's a very good indication that something else is going on. Sanitation may have a lesser effect on these species, and oftentimes you can't really do sanitation to get rid of them. I'm sure Brandon will mention this. He's our Boise Branch Manager, and they have lots of farmlands, and you're not going to clean up the farms. That's just not going to happen. So there's other things we can do in order to control these species of flies. They're typically seasonal because they're breeding outdoors. So once it gets cold outside, you're not going to see as many fly issues. So some of the species we typically deal with over here on the left, this is a lesser housefly. These are the flies. I'm typically not identifying them based on how they look. I'm identifying them based on behavior. So lesser houseflies are the ones that fly around your front door, your back door in dead air. So they just fly in circles. And those are the males, and they are flying around in circles waiting for a female fly to come in so they can mate with her. So you'll see these just fly around and around and around in circles. They are associated with bird droppings often. So sometimes they can be a sign that there's a bird problem nearby. They could also be some like pet droppings. Sometimes you'll start getting more lesser houseflies. There's a nice video on YouTube if you want to look it up. Somebody had, their neighbor decided to breed pigeons, and now the whole neighborhood has lesser houseflies. So sometimes there's some unique things going on. In the middle, we have a housefly. So I'm sure everybody has seen a housefly. Thorax has some lines on it. You know, they can breed in all sorts of places. The dumpster, farm, there's lots of areas you might see them breeding in. And over here on the right, we have a blowfly. So blowflies or bottle flies, they typically are iridescent in color. So they might be green, they might be blue. A lot of times I see a species that's like black with a slight bluish iridescence to it. Those are all blowflies. In particular, they're looking for dead animals or feces to put their eggs in and continue their life cycle. And large flies, very good at flying from far away. So typically, large flies, they're breeding within 100 feet of a building. So that might or may not even be your property. So there may or may not be a lot you can do about the breeding site, but they can also travel from miles away. So if there's farm, you know, a cattle farm across the street, that's definitely going to contribute to some fly issues for the area. And it is important to think about control for these large flies, partly because they are hanging out in pretty disgusting areas. And this is a video on the left. This is a housefly feeding on some nasty gunk. When they feed, they land and they have sponging mouth parts. And so they press down those sponging mouth parts and suck up the food. And they're also, so they're picking up pathogens that way from the nasty area. They're also using their legs to run around in, you know, the gross area. So that is a way for pathogens to be transmitted from one area to another. Over here on the right, this image is of the sponging mouth parts, and there's just lots and lots of surface area for them to pick up different pathogens. They also leave fecal deposits whenever they feed. So sometimes you'll see that in a place, they like to land on edges, and you'll see little black spotting. That's their feces. So they're not only picking up pathogens and moving them, they're also leaving behind their own feces. Okay, so here's our third case study. We have a large food processor, and they have a chronic large fly problem. So all summer long, all spring, going into summer, they were having large flies show up in the building, fly around, so they're annoying people working there. And then they also are ending up in the light trap. So we can tell something's going on because we're getting more and more captures. But the facility is very clean, so we can't, where exactly are these guys coming from? So it turns out it's a house fly. Here's a picture of the fly. That was the issue. House fly, you can look at thorax, has some lines on it. So it was a house fly. Definitely go in, do a really good inspection. So where are these areas where these flies might be breeding? You know, you can look at Google Earth, see if there's anything around. Dumpsters were clean, look great. Trash disposal areas in general, very clean, emptied out regularly, washed down. No, nothing really seen there. Facility was clean, so no moisture building up. Nothing smelled off. Everything looked great. But what about the roof? So that was one area that maybe isn't very typical for a fly inspection. But in this case, where else was there to look? So we went up on the roof, and it turns out there had been some rain recently that it wasn't very common for it to rain in the area. And the roof actually was holding water, and some food debris, some maybe food dust or something had gotten up there. So there was organic material and puddles of water on the roof. They had started drying up. But once we got up on the roof, it was pretty obvious that was the breeding source. So just piles and piles of maggots, housefly maggots up on the roof, which you can see right here. It was actually an amazing sight. So look at that. So we have the maggots over here on the right. As I mentioned before, when flies pupate, they like to crawl away from the moist area. So I guess where the maggots were was where the water, the puddles of water were, and they had started drying up. But the flies, as they were pupating, were moving over to the left and pupating and then becoming an adult. And that's when they would fly around and enter the facility. So it wasn't anything inside the facility. It wasn't the dumpsters, wasn't anything typical. Turns out there was an issue on the roof of some moisture building up. And so that could be easily resolved by the plant. So in general, inspection, very, very important. Even might be the roof, might be somewhere really unique. All fly issues, we want to take those case by case and look around and figure out where that source is, where they are laying their eggs, where their maggots are growing up. Exclusion, of course, if we hadn't been able to find the source. Exclusion, so keeping the doors closed, keeping air curtains or screens on the doors and windows. That could have reduced the flies from coming in more, but it didn't solve the problem. So once we found the problem on the roof, we were able to like vacuum up the flies. There was no rain in the, in the upcoming days. So they would have to like do some work to make sure their roof would drain better. Never good to have standing water on your roof. So we're able to like vacuum up the flies, dry up the area, and actually solve the problem. And hopefully solve the problem for the future as well. Okay, so just in summary, the flies that we mentioned during this presentation, they spend much of their lives in unclean areas. So they're looking for moist environments to lay their eggs and where their larvae can feed. And those are the areas we want to target when it comes to fly control. So we're always trying to seek out the source, do a really good inspection, figure out where that is. And robust fly programs are going to have many parts, and they all play their own part in a good program. So it's going to be sanitation, might be something like bioremediation. We might need to do exclusion, might be traps, might be pesticides. There's lots and lots of different things out there, lots of tools that we can use and customers, we can partner with them and use in order to solve a fly problem. Okay, so Brandon is going to talk about some control solutions for flies. Brandon's our branch manager in Boise, and he has lots of experience with flies.
Thanks, Ashley. So basically, every fly service starts with an inspection, as Ashley was saying. When we're doing that, we're looking for sanitation and seeking out the source, and then doing exclusion on your facility. Once we've identified kind of the sanitation issues, source problems, exclusion, once that's all taken care of, we can start thinking about how we can go about improving what's already there, whether that be, pointing out conditions that are conducive to pests, or, putting door sweeps on doors, providing bioremediation products, ILT trapping, stuff like that, or doing fly wipe downs. Next slide, please. So sanitation and source reduction. Some of the common ones we see are dumpsters or dumpster pads that seem to be either the dumpster overflowing, or there's spillage coming out and it's on the dumpster pad. Those are all really good areas for flies to breed, and are usually the main source of a large fly issue. When you're thinking about small flies, you're thinking more inside. So that middle picture that you see there is a restaurant floor with food and grease and organic material everywhere. We're not going to get rid of the issue unless we can get rid of those sources. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about your sanitation programs. It's very important to have a robust sanitation program that can definitely eliminate, future problems, even when we do get rid of the issue. It's something, this is the main thing that can be done by the client, for any pest control company that you have, is making sure the sanitation is up to par. So that way we can do our part by seeking out the source of the remaining issue and eliminating that. Something also to keep in mind is that picture on the far right is cattle, obviously, and there's flies everywhere. In Southern Idaho, we have dairy farms and cattle farms all over the place. A lot of food processors or even restaurants are backed up to some of these areas. It's not always right on your property. So when something like that happens, we have solutions to mitigate it. Whether we work with the farmer, maybe getting them on a fly control program, or putting products kind of as a buffer before the flies get to you. And we'll get to that a little later. Next slide, please. Exclusion. So one of the easiest ways to keep flies out of your facility is obviously not having a way for them to get in, or an easy way for them to get in. Open doors, as you see on the far left, is just way too easy for them to get in. They're going to get in there and they're going to wreak havoc, especially if there isn't a fly program in place and the sanitation program isn't up to par. The middle picture there you see is a door sweep and a crack in the door that needs to be addressed. Flies can get through, obviously they're not very big, they can get through just about any gap. So putting on door sweeps, filling cracks in walls, so on and so forth, some of that stuff is a great way to keep them from getting in through the cracks in your doors or walls. That far right picture, you'll see a fly on a screen. Screens on doors that have to be kept open, or air curtains, as Ashley was talking about earlier, or screens on windows that are left open at times, is a great way to keep any pests from getting in. And we highly encourage our clients to do all of this as far as exclusion goes. This is something that we will look for in inspections, obviously. We have what's called conditions or action items within our program, where you get your 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 service report. Sorry. And on there, you'll have conditions that are listed. This is what this would fall under, conditions that are conducive to pest activity. Same thing with sanitation, source reduction, things like that. Next slide, please. So bioremediation, as Ashley touched on, is a great way to get rid of what's called biofilm or organic buildup, grease in drains, pipes, grease traps on the floors. That picture on the right or far left is biofilm that was found in a grease trap drain. We have solutions for that issue with bioremediation drip, a drip program where it's dropping bioremediation product every 15 seconds into the drains, and it's just what it's doing is it's just keeping the enzymes and bacteria, healthy stuff, building up in there and eliminating the organic matter. That picture in the middle is a grease trap. That's obviously not what it's supposed to look like. It should not be that disgusting. So there's products for that also. We have grease trap discs that you drop in there, and they're changed out every so often. It's just going to maintain good organic material, just as the drip system does. With that, it also reduces you having to pump your grease traps as often as you normally would. So it's not only good for reducing small fly population, it's also good for budgetary purposes. The picture on the far right is a restaurant that we serviced somewhere years ago, and they had a small fly issue. Well, as you can see, there's a reason why. Mopping with just water or bleach isn't necessarily going to get rid of all of your organic material that builds up on floors, not even just on the floor itself, but inside the cracks is also another issue, as Ashley was talking about earlier. So in order to get rid of that, we have material that you can use in your mop buckets. You mop the same way you normally would. You let it sit for 20 minutes and then mop it back up, and it's pretty clean. Obviously, this kitchen needs a little more attention than just a mopping program. It needs a deep cleaning. So once it's cleaned up, the Mop X or whatever other products you can get a hold of will be kind of a better solution just to maintain the floors. Next slide, please. Trapping. So fly bags are a great solution that we like to use when it comes to trapping flies coming from dumpster areas or, cattle feedlots, whatever it may be. And it's just a way to mitigate them from getting to the building, before they can get in. Fly traps can catch up to 30,000 flies. So yes, it's something that you might be able to buy at Walmart, but it's definitely a very effective tool in fly mitigation. The middle picture is an insect light trap that Ashley was talking about earlier. They are great for not only identifying flies that you may have inside your facility, but they're great for getting rid of the flies once they get in. Once they get in, our options are a little bit limited in what we can do, because, if it's a food processor or if it's a restaurant, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that there is food in there. So the ILT is a very good way to just kind of not use as much chemical and make sure we're identifying and capturing flies that do get in the facility. The same thing goes for the one on the right. It's a musky stick. It's a lower cost option. It's great in restaurants. So just something to kind of look at. Next slide, Ashley. And finally, you'll get to insecticide treatments. Ashley alluded to fly kill zones and wipe downs earlier in her presentation. That picture on the left is a window seal. That's kind of an area that we like to target a lot. Flies are always attracted to sunlight, a specific UV ray. So obviously sunlight's coming through windows. We can hit that up with a fly wipe down, and it kind of takes care of the problem if it's not around food. That middle picture you'll see there's a lot of flies, and it's an eave on a building. In the morning, flies like to congregate on certain areas of buildings. So we can kind of mitigate them by doing a spot treatment in those areas just to make sure that we're knocking them down before they get inside the building. Top right is a solar fly trap. That is something that's used a lot around food plants or anywhere that could be close to fields that could have flies coming off of the vegetation, or if there's a cattle feedlot, dairy farm, same thing I was talking about earlier. We like to stack our effects with that by using residual sprays. The solar fly trap has a fly attractant in it, and then we can use granular bait with that, the bait station that's just below it. We'll kind of stack our effects with all that so that you're attracting them. There's a specific kind of baits that those flies would like, and you're kind of eliminating the issue before it's even getting to your structure. But then even when it does get to your structure, you get the spot treatments, you got the fly wipe downs, and hopefully you have ILTs in the inside that can kind of help us even further. Next slide, Ashley. So just kind of sum it all up. The first defense is always sanitation and exclusion. There's only so much that we can do if the sanitation program isn't up to par where it should be, and if it's not practiced on a regular basis. Exclusion, same thing. You know, we can provide a lot of exclusion solutions. You know, we can install door sweeps, help fill voids and gaps in walls and stuff like that. Or if our clients would like, we can just make a note of it, talk to our contact there, and ensure that it gets handled in a timely manner. Some problems require more effort. If the source is offsite, it's obviously going to require a lot more attention to detail and kind of working with the neighbor facility or farm, whatever it may be, to get the problem solved there. Also with that, it might not be as simple as just us doing stuff. We might have to call in plumbers, or you'll have to call in plumbers, or whatever the case may be, to look for a leaking pipe if it's florid flies. So there's a lot more into it than what meets the eye. Stacking the effects with treatments are required at all times. We will never just hit something with one solution. We always try to stack our effects. That way, if one thing isn't working, something else is going to work at the same time. And then the biggest part is partnership. This is more than just a pest control company coming out and trying to solve all the problems. We always want to work with our clients to build relationships and make sure that we're all meeting each other's needs. And if that's not happening, we definitely want to know about it so that we can fix the problem immediately. So that's all I got. Thanks, Ashley.
Okay, time for questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we will get started on answering some of these. So the first question I have is it common to have both a small and a large fly problem?
Yes, especially in the summer. That's when flies are really ramping up their reproduction and flying around, and they're not slowed down by the cold. So you could have some issues indoors with like fruit flies, and also have, house flies outdoors, maybe coming indoors if you leave your door open. So we've had a heat wave in the Pacific Northwest over the last few days, and I have both small and large flies in my house now because I had to leave all my doors and windows open, and the garbage was, sitting outside on the street because it wasn't garbage day yet. So had lots of flies coming in from outside because I just had to open everything up. And we're seeing this at businesses as well. Can't blame those employees for having to open the doors. And then also, maybe some fruit flies breeding in my drain or something that I need to clean out. So definitely can have both.
Okay, next question is, how often does Sprague inspect for a fly problem?
Yeah, so Our technicians, every time they're at an account, are inspecting for a fly problem. This isn't something that's like a quarterly service or anything like that. If we're on site, we are absolutely inspecting for any pest activity at all.
Okay. Next is, are there different treatment methods for large and small fly problems?
Yeah, so again, we are always trying to find the source of the problem. But depending on where that source of the problem is, there might be other, different treatments that are needed. So sometimes we might have, the dumpsters outside, maybe have some sanitation issues. We might be doing some kill zones at the dumpster, some baiting, asking the customer if we can improve sanitation. So those are the things we would do outside. Indoors, we're usually not baiting for flies as much, though we can bait for flies indoors. And yeah, so small flies, you might be using insect growth regulators more indoors. So that would, maybe that's something you put in the drains. And if there are flies breeding in the drains, they can't molt correctly, make it to adulthood. So again, we're trying to find the source. So depending on where the source is, that's where we kind of want to target our treatments. And there's going to be different remedies based on where exactly they're breeding. Like Brandon showed, he showed the grease traps. Usually those are like fruit flies or something breeding in there, maybe phorid flies. We really want to do some kind of bioremediation program if your grease traps are building up that much.
Awesome. Okay. Next question is, are there early warning signs of a large infestation?
I would say we really use our light traps as a warning sign. So those will draw flies in, and we'll see increases in captures in that, which indicates that flies are ramping up. Visually, people just might be spotting flies more often. So if there's a pest sightings log, we might see flies mentioned. Maybe flies congregating. I think just thinking about the weather. So if it's warming up, maybe, if it's starting to warm up, the snow's melting, that's a sign that flies are going to be more active.
Okay. Next question is, please describe what you mean by a fly wipe down and how were the window seals treated? Meaning, what killed the flies on that window in the picture?
Sure. So there's a couple products we can use to do fly wipe downs. Basically, a fly wipe down is a rag or a paper towel, and we're taking a residual insect bait or fly bait or product that's used specifically for flies, and we're wiping down that area, and the flies land on it because they're attracted to it, not only by, so we're using their biology against them, so there's the UV light coming through the window that they're attracted to, and then there's also an attractant on that bait that they want to feed on. So it lands on it, they feed on it, and they die.
Okay, next is, at one of our locations, we have a 30-yard trash compactor near a set of doors. How practical is it to treat and/or sanitize the trash compactor when it's filling every 3 days or so? Would you recommend the big trap at this location?
Don't typically recommend, you might have some fly bags outside. You might need a fly baiting program around that trash compactor. And we can even do fly bait in bait stations. So if the ground's getting washed down quite a bit or something, we can install bait stations on a vertical surface. The door might need exclusion. You might need air curtains. Sometimes that's not practical, or some other exclusion on the door. And probably light traps, right when you walk through that door, you'll want light traps to the left and right so the flies don't keep getting deeper into the facility. They see that light trap, which they're very attracted to, and they fly off to the side. So there's a lot of things you can do to reduce your risk. even if it's not practical to like keep it 100% clean all the time.
Yeah, just to kind of add on to what Ashley said, a good fly program isn't going to eliminate every fly. It's just going to mitigate your risk of having a huge infestation of flies within the facility. So I think Ashley hit it right on that.
Awesome. Any last minute questions coming in? If not, thank you everyone for attending. And like I mentioned, a recording will be available. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoons.